Hello and welcome back. In this video, we'll be covering about network attacks, starting with sniffing. We will also have a look at spoofing as well. First, what is a network attacks? Well, as you know, in today's world, computers are connected via internet, right? And there are a lot of different protocols and technologies that connect us through the internet as well. Okay, and unfortunately, because of those connections and how those the connections are established, there may be some vulnerabilities that are found which can be exploited by the attackers. So in this section, what we will explore is some of the basics and common ways of exploiting the network functionalities. Okay, let's get started. But firstly, if you haven't done any computer networking, this is a super quick way of looking at how things get connected, right? So in today's computer systems in the network, it's typically viewed in 4 different layers how the data transfers from one computer to the other. Okay, so typically what you see right now is an application, and application contains data. Okay, but before we can send this data, we need to push it down to the network access layer. That means through the wires or wireless medium, it only interprets zeros and ones. Okay, so that's the raw data inputs and outputs that computers can handle. Okay, so from the very top here, we have different layers that handles different tasks, right? And at each step, it's going to add on its own unique headers, okay? And those headers will tell that, okay, this is, for example, a TCP packet, and this header information will contain how this TCP is configured, and also the IP and the MAC, and eventually all of this is converted into zeros and ones and gets transferred to the other side of the network, and then it gets processed layer by layer, and at the end it gets unpacked into data. Okay, so that's the nutshell of how the TCP works. Okay, and those are the names that refer to them. But yeah, you probably don't need to know too much about that, but just remember that what they're called at different layers. Okay, so TCP, as seen here, this is the flow of how data can be transferred to the other end, and this is how the connections are established. So what you just saw before is just the one arrow going from one end to the other. Okay, and typically you have multiple data flowing around the network. So this is a typical client and server architecture where a TCP is a stateful connection. So that means it needs to know how the data is being captured. So client and server, so what happens in TCP is they go through a 3-way handshake. Okay, so the first 3 arrows in this diagram tells you the 3-way communication that's happening between the client and the server to establish that connection. So first, client wants to talk to the server, so it sends a packet, which is a SYN packet. Okay, so it has some arbitrary sequence number X, and once the server receives the request from the client, it's going to reply the SYN with an acknowledgement packet. Okay, so now the sequence number will contain acknowledge it. The server will acknowledge it by x+1 and sets its own sequence y, and then the client acknowledges the server's acknowledgement by sending the ek, which is y+1, and sequence of x+1. Okay, so the sequence belongs to the client, now it's the second one. And then at that point, the network communication channel has been established between the client and the server. So client can start sending data, okay? And this data will contain the sequence number as well as the payload of whatever the data we were sending, okay? And That is what we're trying to exploit, because when people first developed TCP IP architecture, security wasn't really a top priority. Okay, so that should be a lesson that everyone, whenever you're making an app or protocol or procedure or whatever, make sure that you do take into consideration security aspect while you design. So it should be secure by design rather than hacking into it. I meant putting on security layers after you have implemented whatever you have. Okay, so sniffing is a passive attack. That means as a normal user, you're not going to necessarily see any activities in the network to identify that some people may be passively sniffing. Okay, and sniffing captures the network traffic between the two communicating nodes. Typically, you cannot detect sniffing types of attacks or any other passive attacks, as the attack does not leave any traces in the system. Basically, what they're doing is just intercepting packets flowing in the network whichever the wire they are tapping into. Okay, but typically you can mitigate this attack by using encryption. So let's have a look how crucial it is to use an encryption and creating a secure channel, because establishing a secure channel to communicate is important. Okay, so for instance, we have Alice and Bob without any encryption, and that means Eve can tap into any part of this wire and start sniffing whatever the data they're exchanging. So to prevent that, we can add a secure channel. Okay, so this means Eve can no longer actually sniff the packets in the communication channel because everything is encrypted, and the difficulty of decrypting is already shown to you in the encryption decryption part of this lecture. So if you forgot that, please go back a few videos. However, the coverage matters because Eve can easily tap into a different area of the wire and collect data. So this means, for instance, this secure channel may have been established at the gateway router, for instance. So Alice may have a home internet, and this is your Wi-Fi router. And Wi-Fi router may have some protocol to establish a secure communication channel with the receiving part. So this part can be secure, but if you're not using any encryption to communicate with your Wi-Fi router, then Eve can easily tap into that channel and start sniffing. Okay. And there are different tools that allows you to sniff packets. For example, Wireshark, TCP dump, Windows Message Analyzer, and so forth. Out of those, Wireshark is probably one of the most widely used tool. And in fact, Wireshark is not an illegal tool. It's a legitimate traffic analysis tool. And therefore, you can't really identify whether people are using it for malicious purpose or legitimate purpose. Okay. Also, to prevent people from sniffing, there have been some efforts. For example, Chrome used to notify that if you're using HTTP, then it tells you that it's no longer secure. Okay, but I'm not sure if they still do that anymore. But nevertheless, there are efforts to make sure that all the traffic gets encrypted. Okay, and the best solution is to create an encryption end-to-end. However, sometimes that is actually not feasible to implement because, for example, your machine is not powerful enough to support a strong encryption, or do not have any matching encryption standards with the party that you're trying to communicate with. Okay, so there are limitations that we need to work around, and therefore it is crucial that we look into all aspects to make it secure. Okay, so now we're moving on to spoofing, because sniffing although it can be useful, there are its limitations. You're only stealing information that you can that they are communicating about. So if you want to be a bit more active, well, you're trying to spoof the message. Okay, so spoofing is a form of lying to claim that you are someone or something else. Okay, that is masquerading. Okay, and by spoofing, you can progress into hijacking. We'll have a look at that. Okay. There's a lot of different ways of doing spoofing attacks. For instance, IP spoofing is quite common. And if you actually look into doing that, that is actually quite easy to do. MAC spoofing, DNS spoofing, ARP spoofing, website spoofing, email spoofing, and so forth. Okay. So we're going to have a look at IP spoofing, but before that, we're going to have a look at TCP spoofing first, because I didn't list it here. Right? So we have seen this before, our normal TCP connection between the client and the server. So we have the three-way handshake and data being transmitted, right? So as an attacker, what we need to do is we need to first reset the existing connection in order to spoof. Okay, so we do it by sending a SYN. Okay, and then what the server do is, thinking that SYN packet came from the client, so reply to the client sending SYN-ACK. Okay, but client actually didn't really send anything, right? But the attacker can guess what the sequence number from the server may have been. So remember, the server will have its own sequence number generated and sent it to the client. If the attacker can sniff that packet as well, then this attack becomes much easier. Okay, so you can spoof as a client. Okay, so this is a TCP spoofing. Okay, so next is IP spoofing. Okay, so once the TCP session has been reset, so now we have hijacked the TCP section pretty much. We can easily spoof the IP address by modifying the IP packet header. Okay, IPv4 is vulnerable as it does not check for integrity, so there's no security in mind for that version. IPv6 does have some security mechanism to protect it being modified. However, IPv6 can still be spoofed, and there are some different methods, which we will not look into that in this video. This is especially easy for inside attackers, as you don't have to bypass the firewall filtering. So usually firewalls have some sort of a mapping of the network, and it expects certain traffic to be coming from different locations. So if you're trying to spoof somebody that are internal attacker, then you don't really have to bypass the firewall if you're already inside the network. Okay. So here is a typical IPv4 header information. So it does have a lot of different fields that needs to be filled out. But the one that we're interested in is the source address. Okay, and literally it's just a number of bits, and you can just change them. Okay, so once you have spoofed the IP packet through hijacking the TCP and then now spoofing the IP, from here we can do a lot of other stuff. Things like hijack the rest of the whole application stack, do some SYN flood attacks, ICMP redirects, ping or death, etc. Okay, so let's have a look at hijacking. Okay, so we have reset the TCP and then spoofed the IP. So in addition to that, we can perform a full TCP session hijacking in conjunction to the TCP and IP spoofing. Okay, so this hijacking can be used to take over the TCP application. So whatever the application the TCP is providing, we can hijack that. Okay, things like the telnet, file transfer protocols, or remote logins. Okay, and all of those are quite critical applications of TCP. Okay, so once attacker has TCP segment sequence, okay, that means I have correctly guessed the TCP sequence number. Then the connection can be hijacked from that point. Okay? The legitimate user can no longer communicate with the server as the sequence number is no longer valid. That means as an attacker, you have guessed the sequence number correctly and start sending packets as a legitimate, from the server point of view, you're a legitimate user, the client, but the client has lost the sequence number and has to catch up with that, which it will not, it can't do unless it tries to guess or reset the connection itself. However, since you already hijacked the connection, the client, even if they try to re-establish the connection, it just gets dropped because the server thinks you're already connected. Okay. So there are a few different prevention methods to prevent these spoofing attacks causing you for further damages. Things like packet filtering, and typically your internet service provider will have some of those mechanisms implemented for you. Okay, so when you choose an ISP, it's not really all about speed. Or is it? Probably. But it is good to look into what kind of security functionalities they provide. But nowadays, a lot of ISPs, especially the well-established ones, will have an adequate level of security to prevent such attacks. Okay? Trusted hosts should only be used with authentication and encryption. So this is just adding a few more layers of security so that the hijackers have to put in extra efforts by bypassing the authentication and encryption as well. Okay, and of course, updating and maintaining the firewall regularly is a key aspect. Alrighty, so we will finish this video here. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video. Bye.